Good evening and welcome. My name is Guy Delcom, Chief Advancement Officer at ACT. Thank you all so much for joining us for the kickoff of this year's Justice Summer Series. I want to give a quick shout out and thanks to this year's Summer Series sponsor, Broadcat, as well as thanking St. Jude Oak Cliff for generously hosting tonight's conversation here in their office space. Now, for those of you who are joining us who may not be terribly familiar with ACT and with our work, I want to take a brief moment just to define who we are and what we do. Since 2009, ACT has worked to mobilize and equip residents who live in historically underserved and high crime parts of our city, using the justice system to help them fight crime very locally on their street, while sharing with them also the hope that we find in the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, for us, there's a theological motivation to do the work that we do. And that motivation to pursue justice alongside our neighbors is found in the truth of God's love for all humanity. In short, we follow the Bible's mandate and call to do justice, to walk humbly, and to love mercy alongside of our neighbors. And we believe that brings us into a participation in God's work in our world, which is a work of reconciliation. Also, the summer series that you're watching right now, the idea behind the Justice Summer Series has been one that brings together conversations that elevate issues within our city that would be historical injustices, as well as issues that would really allow people to enter into participation and conversation in our city. This conversation has been one where we've highlighted racial equity. We've also highlighted things like the affordable housing crisis and gentrification. Tonight's conversation is going to be another exciting one, I think. It's going to be centered around the idea of safety and shalom in light of COVID-19 and the recent events over these past few weeks. Before we move into our actual panel and discussion, I want to address the recent acts of racism and violence that continue throughout our country. We at ACT are deeply saddened and disturbed by the recent events of racialized violence and brutality against Black men and women all throughout our country. We mourn the killing of yet another unarmed Black man, George Floyd, which horrifyingly only adds to a long list of senseless victims of individuals who've fallen victim to senseless acts of racism, violence, and murder that has continued to plague Black men and women for far too long. Our prayers for mercy and healing will continue, but we will also do more than pray, and we invite you to join us. We will continue to stand against these injustices and alongside Black men and women to see an end to racist violence, murder, and brutality here in our city. If you find yourself wondering, what can you do? This is a good place to start this conversation tonight. And with that, I'd like to transition into our panel, introduce to you briefly a colleague of mine, Evangeline Heppenstall, who is tonight's moderator. And also great thanks to Mr. Jon Fortune, who's our Assistant City Manager, as well as Reverend Todd Atkins in South Dallas.
Good evening. Thank you all for joining us tonight. I have with me today our two panelists, distinguished guests, Reverend Todd Atkins, Mr. Jon Fortune. Let's start, before we begin our panel, let's learn a little bit about them. So we'll begin with Mr. Fortune. Mr. Fortune has been a public servant in local government for over 28 years. He is currently the Assistant City Manager for the City of Dallas. And before he was Assistant City Manager for Dallas, he was that for Denton. Before we move on, would you mind taking just a sentence and saying, what does that mean? What is your role as Assistant City Manager?
Thank you. I appreciate that. So, as you know, the City of Dallas, or you may not know, the City of Dallas is a council manager form of government. That means that it's managed by a professional city manager. Of course, an organization as large as the City of Dallas, as you can imagine, there needs to be some segregation of duties and responsibilities. And so there are a number of assistant city managers that support the office and function of city management in the City of Dallas. And I happen to be the assistant city manager that's responsible for public safety. So police, fire, emergency management, the courts, and detention are the departments that fall under my portfolio. City managers, we're responsible for the operations of the city, whereas the city council, they're elected and they provide the policy direction and guidance for us in the city. So hopefully that gives you a little sense as to what I do.
Very helpful. Thank you. Our second panelist is Reverend Todd Atkins. He is the pastor of Salem Institutional Baptist Church, where you have been there. I guess you're approaching your 10-year anniversary, but you went there as a child.
Yes.
Yes.
Church I ever known.
And I loved your bio. You said you obeyed the call to become a pastor in 2001.
Yes.
And in addition to being a pastor, he is a link between the South Dallas community and social justice, namely as a co-founder and president of the South Dallas Fair Park Faith Coalition.
Yes.
Did I get that right?
You got
okay,
it
thank
right.
you. And so the Faith Coalition, right, it connects historically marginalized communities with corporate and government entities to help promote positive economic growth and social growth.
Yes, it does.
Would you mind taking a sentence and helping us understand what that means?
Well, we want to give voice to the community. We want to give voice to those who feel as though their voice has been muted for so long. And we've discovered that it's when we come together collectively that we have more power. We don't believe in reinventing the wheel. So we partner with organizations that specialize in certain areas that can help build our community together. Tell our community that you don't have to reinvent it, but let's partner with someone who has a heart for the community, have the resources to do what we need to get done. And that's how we affect change in our community.
That's incredible. So the topic of our panel tonight is safety and shalom in light of COVID. And if you are who I was several years ago before I joined ACT, you might be asking, with safety and shalom in light of COVID, what is shalom? And so I thought we'd start there before we dive into our questions. And I'm going to cite directly from Timothy Keller's Generation Justice. And he says shalom is complete reconciliation, a state of the fullest flourishing in every dimension because all relationships are right, perfect, and full of joy. And we at ACT, we fundamentally believe that Jesus Christ is at work reconciling all things broken and unjust, and that one day he will bring that work to a fulfilled completion. So back in April, when we were designing the vision for this generation, this Justice Summer Series, COVID was at the forefront, and there was a lot of fear and unknown. What was the virus like? Our health, effect of the economy. For me, a loss of control was very hard. And we saw early on that there were going to be certain parts of our city that were going to be more affected by COVID than others. So although COVID might not know what the color of our skin is or what zip code we live in, we know, and as has been reported in the Dallas Morning News, that Black Americans in Texas and in the United States generally have been more likely than any other racial or ethnic group to be hospitalized or lose their lives. In Dallas, most of those cases are in the southern half of the city. But if you go up 5 miles, and if you ask me what my saving grace has been while we've been sheltering in place, I'd say without a doubt it was good weather and a great neighborhood. We're practically living in our front yard, walking loops around the neighborhood. I send my kids biking up and down the sidewalk, and I mostly know where they are at any given moment. But the families that we serve and that we partner with at ACT, that is not their reality. These families live with crime and violence outside their front door. They are not able to walk around their neighborhood. They are not able to send their kids in their front yard. So in that sense, I am very much aware that I am privileged, but also that safety is essential. And in the last several weeks, we have now experienced what Dr. Tony Evans called, which resonated with me. He called the time right now a cultural pandemic. He said the protests following I'm trying my best to articulate. It's hard to know whether you're saying it the right way, but the protests following the killing of George Floyd have shined a bright light on racial injustice, systemic structural racism, and the role of policing, especially in communities of color. I'm asking myself, how do I be an anti-racist? And so while we only have this hour together, and as we reflect on the topic of safety and shalom in light of COVID, I do want us to start our time together with each of you reflecting for a few minutes on the following question. So the killings of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor and George Floyd by police officers have exposed long-standing racial inequities in our country and having occurred during the most impactful pandemic in our times. Would you please share some thoughts, and we'll start with you, Reverend Atkins, share some thoughts on that for us tonight.
I think with the tragedy that affected our brothers and sisters, shined a very bright light on a common reality for so many people. Considering with the loss of George Floyd, the wonders of technology put us right there in that moment. Mm-hmm. So many times we can avoid realities until it blinds us right in front of us. And I think what we saw and what we are experiencing now is the reality that so many people have faced for years is now in our face, and it cannot be avoided. Cannot be avoided. And so I think this is a pivotal time for us to really to take it to heart, but not only have sympathy and empathy, but we see a call to action. That I've told people, I don't want to see another mother have to stand behind microphones with tears, talking about the loss of their child at the hand of someone who should have never been wearing the badge in the first place. So it is a time of reflection. It's a time of deep emotion, but it's a time for a call to action. Mm-hmm. And as scripture says, for such a time as this, we have been called to act.
Thank you, Reverend.
Mm-hmm. I would say that I really appreciate the way Pastor Evans described that as an epidemic, because I think while we've been focused on COVID for some time now, a very short period of time rather, this epidemic of racism has been around for decades and decades. And as Pastor Reverend Atkins mentioned, this is now a time for not just the impacted community that they call to action. It's a time for all of us to unite and come together in shalom with action and stand side by side and say, enough is enough. I mean, this has got to change. Policing has to change. Our view of each other has to change. And this is an impactful moment for our country, for our city, and for our community. And I do think this epidemic is ironic that we're in the COVID because, as I said, this epidemic of racism has been around for far too long.
Mm-hmm. So when we talk about safety in our city and your role as the assistant city manager, what would you like us to know this evening about safety in Dallas right now?
So a couple of things I would tell you is first and foremost, safety can mean a lot of things, right? And so in the context of a normal year, we would be focusing safety discussions mostly around crime and how well we can provide services through fire and EMS services and policing services. And to be quite honest with you, the city has seen some challenges in the last 18 months with crime, violent crime specifically. And we ended the year last year with an increase in aggravated assaults. We ended the year with an increase in murders and burglaries. And so the chief and the city, and along with the mayor's leadership and direction, we developed some strategies for how we wanted to address those issues in this 2020. Of course, we didn't make it far into 2020 when COVID became a very impactful incident in our city. And quite frankly, a lot of the things we had planned were either amended, adjusted, or put on hold because the way we wanted to protect our community had to change. And so we are now in a different territory than where we were just a few months ago. And so a lot of our effort and focus obviously has been on police and actual public safety. We're also now very actively engaged in making sure the public stays safe from a health perspective by making them aware of how to be safe, how we can test people in the city to be able to ensure that they're protected and that they can protect others. And as you mentioned in your opening comments, well, we have a lot of work to do because there are communities, minority communities in our city who are underserved, not only from a testing standpoint, but from transportation to get to testing sites, from job opportunities, from other things. And we're working very hard to try to make sure that those communities can get the equal and equitable treatment, just like the other people and other sectors of our community are able to do. Under the Mayor Johnson and the City Council's leadership, they appointed a an individual named Dr. Badgett, who has been responsible for helping assess how we can do better in integrating our services into those communities who have been underrepresented and underserved for so long, specifically as it relates to COVID.
Mm-hmm.
So we are calling an audible, and we're trying to focus our energy on the well-being of people's health as well as on their personal safety. And so it's a new day in Dallas, and every day seems to be a new day, but we're doing the best we can to make our residents feel that they're getting the services they deserve.
In addition to the testing efforts on COVID and reaching the communities that you discussed, are there any other initiatives that are in the works or that you're beginning to roll out right now regarding safety?
Public safety specifically, yes. There's several actually very law enforcement centric type strategies that the police department has in place. Typical things that you might see, such as a warrant roundup after high offense perpetrators, people who are known to be violent offenders. Those are very typical. One of the things that I would like to just mention and bring to your attention is something that we've been having discussions about specifically in the city, and that is how we can bring outside resources outside of the police department to come and be a partner with law enforcement to look for how we can think about providing solutions differently. Reimagining police is a buzzword, and it's a very hot topic right now. Mm-hmm. But one of the components of our crime plan at the beginning of the year was to create an Office of Integrated Public Safety Solutions. And they're really focused on doing an analysis of high crime areas and look at the spatial features, the environmental factors in those high crime areas that we know are contributors and factors that lead to incidences of high crime or violent crime specifically. So through this new function and this new office, we're using an approach called risk-terrain modeling that is a scientific approach to how we can address there's factors that are present in various communities, and specifically in those high crime communities. We know if we can change those factors, it doesn't require the police department to put people in jail. It's a very proactive engagement way for us to be able to change the nature of that crime in that area. ACT is a good example of one of those organizations that we partner with through DPD, through the Dallas Police Department, to go to communities and provide a non-law enforcement way of changing the behavior of individuals, and we appreciate that partnership. And so this new office that we've created is a direct tool. It's a new tool for us to kind of capitalize and use the synergy of relationships like we have with ACT and other organizations to be able to provide those alternative ways of fighting crime and reducing crime.
That's exciting. Well, I'm looking forward to keeping track of that. Reverend Atkins, what would you like us to know about safety in South Dallas, safety through the eyes of your congregants?
I think safety in South Dallas, such a weighty question.
It is.
It's a desire for us to have the same opportunity as you described earlier, to be able to send our children biking down the streets without the worry that if they get out of sight, maybe something will happen to them. We constantly are concerned about safety, public safety, policing. Gunshots are not an unfamiliar reality in which we live, but we also strive to build those relationships with our local police officers, particularly in the Bear Street substation, because frankly, our 911 experience is not always positive. And so it's good to have those relationships with officers that we see that can really help us to navigate those waters. But I think South Dallas wants what everyone else wants. We want to be able to not worry about the car being broken in, not worry about the home being broken in. But I think South Dallas is unique because South Dallas has a stigma attached to it. Even from those who are outside of our community, maybe never stepped foot in our community, consider it to be just almost a war zone. And so we're fighting not only the realities of safety, but also the stigma that comes along with being a part of a community that has been stigmatized and marginalized for so long.
Have you noticed a difference for your congregation in terms of safety, pre-March, post-March, kind of during this, the COVID pandemic, cultural pandemic, all of that?
Yeah, I think we have noticed a difference. I think we were so hopeful and we have been working on programs, and COVID just put a stop to so many things. Even as my brother was talking about, even with the testing, I believe we have been disproportionate in that. We have testing centers, for example, at American Airlines was the first big one, but transportation became an issue. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with individuals who said, well, if I get tested, that's one thing, but what if the test positive? I don't want to call my employer and tell them I'm positive because that's 2 weeks without pay. So I would rather just not know, continue to work, and just take the chips where they may. And I think that was a reality for so many people. And I think it remains a reality today. I mean, those who are working by the hour, they can't afford to stay at home. And so many people had to violate the orders because, hey, if I stay at home, who pays the rent, who pays the light bill? And, I see the city saying no one can evict, but evidently my landlord didn't get the memo. So I got the threat already. And when they heard the stimulus was coming, okay, all that goes out the window. So I think it's the reality that we face so many days, and the pandemic has just highlighted so many of the disparities that are evident in so many areas.
So when you hear these stories and these realities from your congregation, how do you, as the pastor of a church in South Dallas, how do you care for your congregation when you hear these things?
I rely on my faith. I think it's a belief in God. We have a saying that is true: the Lord will make a way somehow. And that somehow looks so different for so many people. So it's the praying, the empathy, but it's also the connections. I'm grateful that I'm connected to some great people, some people who can get things done. And so kind of my job has been not only pastor, but HR director. What skills do you have? Let me see if I can call somebody who's hiring. And so that's what it's all about, being a pastor, jack of all trades, particularly in our community. And so it's just meeting them where they are. And that looks differently for individuals. I can tell you, I have those who are low skilled, have the same concerns of those who I graduated to college, but still face layoffs. And overqualified, we all know what that looks like. But it's a reality. But we have to care for people every day, pre-pandemic, during the pandemic, post-pandemic. You can't stop caring for people, no matter what it looks like, no matter how tough it is.
That's so true. Mr. Fortune, when you hear kind of the caring for people and you think about the city's role in this, but also, I'd love to know how we can help the city care for our neighbors. So could you give us some ideas of how Dallasites and those of us on this call this evening can support the city of Dallas right now?
I appreciate that question because, the city is what we make it as individuals, right? So to some individuals, the city is just a place to work and they don't do much else. Other people, the city is their place where they were born and raised, and they don't ever go out of a 4 or 5 block area of so their city is something. So that's a question that really means, something different to depending on who you're talking to. From my perspective and kind of dealing with the things that we're facing in our community right now, I would tell you that there's a couple of things that it's not really a specific action that somebody can take as much as it is just to take advantage of an opportunity. When you have an opportunity, and I'll speak to a person who was probably not raised the way a lot of people in South Dallas were raised. And, I have a sphere of influence and a sphere of friendships and people that I interact with, just like your listeners do. It's something that we should all do individually, is to make sure folks understand what's going on in our city right now. The issues of racial inequity, the issues that are facing about health inequity. There's job inequity in our city. Pastor Atkins talked about, people, trying to find a job. They're not even really afforded the same opportunities in South Dallas to have a job in their community like the rest of the city. So it's about making people aware of these problems and these issues. And I think that is something that we can do to provide an awareness that helps bring a better synergy around solutions for these problems. Hold the city accountable hold me accountable for providing the level of safety that we need in our city and the environment so that his parishioners can feel safe, not hear gunshots, and all of those things. And so the last thing I would tell you that I think is needed in our community right now is for folks to have a discussion and a community conversation about conflict resolution. We have experienced a lot of violence in our city, and a majority of that a very large portion of that are tied to individuals having arguments and learning and not knowing how to resolve their differences in a peaceful way. And one of the things that's kind of been experienced since we've had at-home sheltering and people not able to go to different places, parks were closed, movies were closed, the workout gyms were closed, or just whatever folks used as recreation, those opportunities were gone. And we did see a kind of a resurgence and concern starting to creep up with a lot of domestic abuse in the homes. Mm-hmm. And so those are the things that I would say, take advantage of your own influence in your sphere of people to educate your friends, your coworkers about these issues and bring awareness to them. That's what I would recommend.
Reverend Atkins, what about you? How can we support you?
I think it's what we're doing now. It's highlighting the conversation and using, as my brothers say, our circle of influence. One of the positive things, if I can say positive about the pandemic, is the heart of people that I wouldn't expect had opened up. I can't tell you how many times I get calls where we have a trailer of food, we have a trailer of dairy, and I'm like, all pockets are full. I'm telling you, just get it. Whether you want it or not, just get it. Mm-hmm. And so there's an awakening that we all are interconnected. And I think we have to do that in communities. We have to do that with our city. We have to realize that the city is not some giant entity that just sits downtown, but it has the ability to influence every aspect of life. Recreation. I mean, they run the parks and all of these things. And so there is a mutual connection that I believe everybody is feeling right now. And everybody, I'm grateful for this moment. I think God moves in mysterious ways, is that people want to help. And they want to help somebody that they normally don't help, you see. That they normally help within their own little circles. But now they're reaching out, calling way across town. I got a call from a large church in Plano. Call and say, hey, we get a big refrigerator trailer come in. And I'm like, well, how much can I get? Is this thing gonna sit? It'll be refrigerated. We'll sit the truck there and stay as long as you want. And whatever they don't take, we'll take it back. And I'm like, wow, what an awakening. Now we see what partnership relationship looks like with communities who have been underserved, by people who have influence in certain circles that can really get things done. And I just pray that this continues, not just during the pandemic, but post-pandemic. That's where this relationship building. I just pray it's lasting.
Keep that momentum.
We have to. Yeah. We have to, because if we lose it, we lose the opportunity of this moment. And God forbid of us to take a world pandemic, which the world had been taken to its knees, and not take full advantage to address inequity, to make closer partnerships with our cities, with our policing, with our home, with our education, every aspect. We have an opportunity to do that. And I just pray we take full advantage of it.
I hear hope in your voice, and I hear hope in your voice. How has your, kind of personally for each of you, how has your Christian faith affected how you've lived your life over the last several weeks? I know that it's certainly been a challenge for everybody in a multitude of different ways, but I also love hearing the hope. And so I'd love to hear kind of how your faith has influenced kind of how you've walked through the last several weeks.
Well, I'll start, as Reverend talked about calling to the ministry. I have my entire life felt the calling to public service. And, the good thing about that is I've never doubted what I'm doing is what the Lord wants me to do, right? So I've always felt that this is where I want to be. And, just like any other profession, you have good days and you have bad days. And, sometimes you need your faith to carry you through those bad days and those long days. And the last few months have been very difficult for me personally. I've been a lot of long days and long nights and a lot of time away from my family. And it's through their support and through their encouragement that keeps me going, in the moment by moment. But it's truly my faith in knowing, that I'm doing what I've been called to do, to serve other people. And at the end of the day, when nobody's thanking you, you still have to just feel good about what you've done, that you're doing it for the love of others. And so that's how it's carried me and sustained me through this, because I know we will overcome this. We will persevere. Dallas is a very resilient city, and we're going to be on the other side of this very soon. And I'm looking forward to continuing to serve and help this city get to the next level. And so that's what it really means to me personally.
Mm-hmm.
I think hope and faith and relationship with God is what has really given us the strength to get through this. I mean, in an instant, life was dramatically changed.
Mm-hmm.
My wife's an educator, so she's working from home. Now she has to get her work, as well as 2 children.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm in healthcare as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm worried about my patients whose families can no longer see their mothers, can see their brothers and sisters.
Mm-hmm.
But I think even when life gets the darkest, it's when God turns the light on. And I think I really had to accept the fact, God, this is really out of my control.
Mm-hmm.
and it was that surrender to really rely on the relationship with God. God, how are you going to take care of a church that's 132 years old that has never had to close its doors before? In 132 years, there has never been a Sunday where our church has not been open. But wow, here we are. And 3 months later, God is still providing. And so I had to really depend on God more than ever before. And if I didn't have that relationship, I wouldn't have made it.
Mm-hmm.
I would not have made it. And it's that hope that makes me get up with a smile
Mm-hmm.
and say, we're going to work this thing out together.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm hopeful that we have some questions from our listeners back home.
Okay.
This feels kind of funny to say that out loud. I miss that we're not all together in person. And now I'm going to learn how I get to ask these questions.
And we get to figure out how to answer them.
Right? Exactly.
Tag team, my brother.
Well, I tell you what, while we're waiting, Mr. Fortune, I noticed recently, kind of related to COVID, I noticed that we've started to see some hospitalizations creep back up a little bit.
Yes.
What is the city's position right now on kind of what we're currently facing with COVID?
Concern. I will tell you that the last week we've seen the numbers start increasing again. We had plateaued in the mid 250s in terms of the daily cases that were being reported.
Mm-hmm.
In the last 4 or 5 days, that's been up around 300. In the last 2 days, it's been above 300. I will tell you that we have increased the testing in the city that's going on. And so the percentages of positives are somewhat consistent.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not saying it's normal to expect that we're going to get more. It's a concern.
Mm-hmm.
And, as we test more, in the city council just this past week approved authorization for the city staff to work with the county health department to actually increase the level of testing even more.
Mm-hmm.
As we talked about earlier, to be able to get into some of the hardest hit communities, especially those that are impacted with no health care opportunities. And so I expect that we're going to continue to be concerned. The governor just today announced an extension of the state's disaster or his emergency declaration through July. Right now, we're still under restrictions, believe it or not. I know it doesn't feel that way if you're out. For those watching, we were all in masks just a few minutes ago. We just took them off just for the purposes of this interview.
My mask is right here.
Yeah, so you could so you could see us. We were all masked up. But I think there is a concern that there's been a balance about the economics of getting the cities back open, and the balance about the health and what we do when we take those steps back toward normal life. And so we're in a difficult area, I think, because the next few weeks will determine whether we're going to level off and taper back down or keep going. And in fact, I would say that the concern being with the level of protests and the level of groups getting back together, even even that is a potential for exposure for people. So.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we're ready for our next question.
Christy Lichtenberg's question is, what are some of the most promising sources of economic development in South Dallas that would allow those who are here now to stay here and also for everyone to rise together?
You city man.
Yeah. So we are, the city manager just this past week announced that he was, several of you may have seen it. We've announced a level of a number of police reforms, as we talked about relationships and the importance of those relationships and regaining and or establishing trust with our community. And we recognize that we have to change. And so we've laid out a first step, if you will, of how we're going to do that. Tandem with that, the city managers talked about in the weeks ahead a strategy of economic development that will provide us the ability to address that very issue about jobs, not just jobs in the city, but jobs in those portions of the city where there's been an inequity of development in the past. And so what the city needs to do is develop strategies around the outcome that we want. And that's what we're working to do. So I hope that in the days ahead, we'll be able to have more specific and direct levels of information, strategies that will be presented to the city. I pointed to you, I'm sorry. Presented to the city council. Your father on the city council. And so and he actually leads the economic development committee. In the days ahead. So we'll have opportunities. And I know that for years that's been a focus, but it's time for some of our actual development policies to come to a place where they're directly targeted to promote those type of developments for jobs, for opportunities. We need healthcare in the Southern Dallas. We need, jobs that are not in the service industry. We need physical professional level jobs, and working with UNT Dallas and some of those organizations, I think we can get there. It's just going to take all of us working together. You may have a perspective on that.
I do. I think the excitement that I hear is great, but I think a lot of times we feel as South Dallas proper that we get lumped into Southern Dallas, and Southern Dallas means particularly Oak Cliff and that area, and so I'm hopeful, as you say, that the focus will be on those pockets of the community that are often either lumped together or those parts of the community that are normally skipped over. I think it's great to have a Southern Dallas strategy, but I think that it should be a strategy for South Dallas economic renewal. If you're looking through South Dallas now, you have homes being built. You really don't know who owns them. You have developers coming in purchasing great swaths of property with really a lot of community engagement. And so I think all of that, as far as the relationship that we have, is that we really want to be able to have those conversations throughout so that we make sure everybody's included.
Well, and if I could add to that, I think that's housing is actually the tandem subject as it relates to economic development. Jobs are one thing, but if you don't have housing choices or housing opportunities affordably to be able to live and actually build equity and actually to make the changes in your life that will get people to a different set of circumstances in their future, more secure. I think those are two things that have to go together. I think that's a good point. Yeah.
Next up.
Kendall White is asking, a common call to action I'm seeing is to vote. Is Dallas doing anything special to ensure voting sites are safe, accessible, and efficient?
That's a really good question. Obviously, we want to make sure people can reach out to vote. I think that is a tenet of everything we do in our society is voting. And so, yes, we're going to do everything we can to make sure voting sites are open and accessible. We had an experience with COVID during one election cycle, and obviously we're kind of on bated breath as we get into the next election cycle. I would like to just add a piece of that, though, that maybe not be voting related, but it's census related. And that is just as important as it is right now to vote. It's as important to make sure that everybody is filling out and completing their census, because that census and the information gained in that census will help dictate our resources to be able to address housing, to address economic development, and some of those quality of life things in our community for the next decade. And so voting certainly important, high on our priorities, but also that census right now. So those watching, if you haven't taken the opportunity to complete that, it's easy. It's fast.
Yeah.
And you should do it and do it today, please.
And it's ultimately important in communities like mine that are normally undercounted.
That's right.
I mean, we're talking about 10 years of funding. It's not just what happens today, but we're talking about a decade. From everything, it affects everything from school lunches to economic development, all of this. And so we have encouraging everybody, get out there and protest, make your voice heard, but make sure you count it twice. You count it on the census and you count it at the poll.
That's right.
That's where the changes lie.
I was reading in a Dallas Morning News article that was commenting on the low levels of voting for local elections. And it was noting that some of the protests here in the city have actually had more people than the people that have voted in certain local elections. And it's just really making me think about, if you can take the momentum that we're all feeling and translate it into the vote, there's still so much potential there that has not been realized.
You're absolutely right.
I think that's true.
Another question?
Don Stevens' question is, what are things that you are doing currently during this pandemic that will continue once the pandemic passes?
Oh,
That's a good question.
I like that one. Thank you, Don.
You want to start first? I can go. If you want to.
You know it's a good one when
I
they're...
think the connections that we have, the feeding program we're having, the connections we have with individuals who are serving. One of the questions we ask all of those who want to serve in South Dallas is, are you just here right now? Or are you here long term? And I think we need to know that up front, because we want to know who's here for the long term and who's here just for the moment. You need both. Both are very important, but we strive to build relationships. It's the lasting change. So I pray that the amount of food that's being distributed, because we are in a food desert, not only in South Dallas, but parts of Oak Cliff as well. So I pray those things continue after the pandemic. And honestly, that is my biggest concern, that I don't want so much resources to be poured into our community during the pandemic. And then once the pandemic is over, all these resources are immediately pulled out, because now we're back to where we started.
That's a great question. Great answer. And I would add to that. There's two sides of this in my answer. One is more the practical. I think we've gained a lot of efficiency and learned how to do meetings like this in a way that makes it better for all of us. Although I miss people. I love seeing you folks, because face-to-face is really good, and we won't, cut those all together, right? But the other side of it is from a city perspective and emergency management preparedness, I think this gives us a wake-up call that, if not today, someday in the future, something else is going to happen.
Right.
And so we got to remember how to not only prepare for ourselves, but have a mindset of how we're going to support and help each other. You talked about it, people from all over the Metroplex reaching out to you and your congregation and how to help them. And so that's what I hope we continue, is that mindset of togetherness and that mutualness that we get as humanity, and what we're all working together. And I think, quite frankly, those are the kind of things that can help us deal with this pandemic of racism, quite frankly, and helps us focus on something more common as opposed to what we see as different in us, in our city. So.
Yes.
EP has a city-related question. Does the Office of Integrated Public Safety Solutions focus on community policing? What is the city's stance on this, and what are some initiatives being promoted or developed, if applicable?
So, it is a form of community policing. There really are no police officers directly in the Office of Integrated Public Safety Solutions. It's intended to be outside of the police department. However, we do have risk detectives. We do have a team of people who work with our community prosecutors. When there's high crime properties and when there's property owners who do not address that crime, we do have the ability to file a lawsuit against that property and to try to bring change. And so the office is working in tandem with those functions of the city, but it's not directly related to community policing. However, the police department is a community policing agency, and as Reverend mentioned a few minutes ago, the importance of working with the neighborhood patrol officers and developing those relationships. Those are probably the most impactful way in which we can influence the safety of a community. When the community can trust those officers who are in their neighborhood and who are assigned to help them whether it's a specific individual that needs to care, getting services from somebody, some other agency in the city, or it's a crime-related issue. Mm-hmm. The Office of Integrated Solutions is going to help look at issues like lighting. They're going to look at issues such as the environmental factors. And so if those are called community-related changes, then yes, it's community policing. It's just a different branch.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think that's needed. I think it's the relationship. And I hope that comes out of this movement. Is the highlight of the relationship with our police officers that are important. Even the abatement of properties is important, and how we do that. I mean, because we had some people who are good property owners, but because of the crime around their property, I know one individual had to tear down 2 homes. Mm-hmm. One they inherited, and another one they bought for their retirement because of the crime that's on one corner that everyone knows about, and he can't rent it because he's renting it.
Well, those are the problems that the office is intended to specifically address. Vacant properties is blighted properties is a target and is an attraction, a magnet, if you will, for people to loiter, and then they loiter, and then crime happens, and so it's a cycle. And it's through housing policies, through just remediation of high grass and other things. Code enforcement is an extremely important thing. I know folks feel difficult or feel frustrated if they get a notice of violation that I need to mow my grass, but it's all a part of us working together as a city to make sure that there's an environment there that's not conducive to some of those behaviors.
Yeah, and it has to be a relationship, because what I have some people feel like is because of the development in our community.
Yeah.
That the pressure is being put on to get rid of these houses or these.
The gentrification is a problem. Yeah, absolutely.
And so I think that's why it has to be an ongoing relationship, so that we have to be in the policy discussion so that we can educate our community on why certain things are being done. I think through that relationship, we can give some cover to the city to say, hey, the city is not coming in to try to take your property. But I believe there has to be mechanism that helps those who want to stay in South Dallas, want to maintain their property, but because of external issues are having extreme difficulty and a great difficulty navigating the city system.
Well, that's exactly where ACT's model fits in.
Yes.
Right? Because we equip residents who have a vision of what they think a safe neighborhood would feel like. And the important thing about ACT's model is that it's our clients who have the legal standing. So it's not ACT that is moving here. ACT is equipping and providing the tools and the resources so that they can be the change agents, and they can enact the change that they see as possible.
Yes.
One more question.
We have a comment from Christy Lichtenberg. Okay. Happy birthday, Pastor.
Well, thank you. Yes, today is my birthday. I'm 38. Oh my God. I'm getting close to
I would sing, but it's not one of my strengths. It's really better that we don't. Wonderful.
Chaz Taylor has a question all the way from Chicago.
Oh, man.
How can ACT and its supporters help the city and churches in South Dallas address the public safety or economic inequities that the pandemic has brought more public awareness to?
That's a good question. Well, I mean, I think the mission is already established. Evangeline talked about it, and that's already in place. And so the Dallas Police Department and ACT, we meet and we strategize on how we can work together. And so by supporting ACT and their cause and their mission, you're directly having an influence and outcome in what happens in the city of Dallas. And so that's what I would say the answer is get engaged with ACT, make sure that you're supporting them in all their needs so that they can be able to continue to do what they do. We've had multiple conversations about expanding, what you do, because it makes a difference. And it's those non-traditional ways of providing solutions that are going to really be the most impactful going forward.
I think ACT is just a perfect model of what it means to be someone who's on the ground engaging, that does not have to just go in and go out, but they remain in community. We walk together. We encourage churches to be a part of this. Churches have congregations sign letters of support. I mean, that's what it's all about. It's partnering with organizations that already are getting it done on the ground, but also encouraging our circles to, hey, let's see how we can help ACT even more to reach more people, to help more people in the community, because we have to have that community support. In our community, Acts makes no bone about it. They got to have those partners. Hey, come on, residents, let's help us. And part of our responsibility as pastors and faith leaders is to tell them we're the hands and feet of Jesus. That's not only good on Sunday, but on Monday, if we're going to get rid of that drug house next door, he needs our hands and our feet. And the easiest thing we can do is pick up a pen and sign a letter. And so those are the practical ways that we bring about the transformation that we want. Partner with somebody who has the ability to get it done, but they need the community support. They need the church's support in our community.
And you were saying about wanting the relationships that have been built right now to carry on even when this pandemic ends. And I mean, Act's model could not exist without its partners with the Dallas Police Department, with the City Attorney's Office, with code compliance, but arguably most importantly with the neighborhood associations, with the churches, with the local leaders, and helping the neighbors understand that they are not isolated from each other and that together they have common goals that they can unify around.
Yes.
So, well, what I'd like to do. Oh, we got one more. Excellent.
Oh man, come on, keep rapid fire.
For our last question,
Every
it's
minute
for
from you.
Pastor Atkins from Kendall White. Can you speak to any partnerships and advocacy in the Dallas faith community you've seen that support Shalom in Dallas, and where more work is needed?
I think more work is always needed in our community. South Dallas is in the midst of a transformation now, and we're looking for lasting partners. Acts is one. Dallas Area Interface was another organization that we've worked with, but we're still looking for partners. There's so many aspects of our lives that really need help. Too often, I think people paint a grim picture of our community. When I walk into church, I see life. I see children. I see elderly. I see adults. I see people sitting on their porches that we wave to. It's in the midst of a transformation. But anytime there's a transformation, there's a risk of people getting lost in it. And I think that's what we don't want. We want the development. We want the engagement. We need community partners that really have a heart for the people who are there and not just a focus on the people who are coming. And so I think it's those churches, those organizations that's on the ground that love the community, but most of all committed to stay in the community. That's why I'm hopeful through the diversity that I see throughout the protests, Black Lives Matter movement, all of the diversity is extraordinary. It's a blessing of God. We have to keep that momentum going throughout every aspect.
I'd written this quote down here to share with us, with everyone tonight, from Abraham Heschel, who's an Hasidic Jew who walked with Martin Luther King during the Civil Rights Movement. And during that racially divisive time, he said, "Morally speaking, there is no limit to the concern one must feel for the suffering of human beings, that indifference to evil is worse than evil itself, and that in a free society, some are guilty, but all are responsible." And I feel like what I'm hearing from both of you is both a hopeful call to action, but also a call to hold us responsible, that we hold each other responsible. And all of this. I'm so grateful that you both spent the time with me tonight. It's not enough for this discussion. It's just one piece of a larger discussion. But I hope that as we've listened this evening, which I feel like is always the first step, that we'll take what we've learned tonight into our homes and our workplaces, with our friends, with our families, and we have hopefully some really uncomfortable conversations and enlightening ones too. I think that's really going to stick with me, the COVID-19 pandemic and the cultural pandemic, to have them both happen right now. I'm curious, what history will write about this time. Before we wrap up, I would like to pass this over to my colleague, Claire Crane, who is out there. And she's going to close out our time together. She has a couple more items that she would like to share with us all. Thank you all for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Evangeline. My name is Claire Crane, and I work on our development team at ACT. Just wanted to take a moment to thank everyone again for joining on the stream, to our panelists, to Reverend Atkins and Mr. Fortune for your insight that you shared. And just the reminder that we have to just continue to love our neighbor well, not just now, but in every season. Also wanted to give a huge shout out to our Justice Summer Series sponsor, Broadcat. Thank you to your generosity that allowed us to be able to do this. Also to St. Jude Oak Cliff for helping to host us tonight. If you're interested in learning more about ACT, we'd love to talk to you more about that. And so you can email us at info@actforjustice.org, and we would love to connect. Our vision at ACT is to see safe neighborhoods where crime is no longer tolerated and hope is restored. So we'd love to tell you more about that. You can also follow us on ACT_Justice and keep up to date with us. Our second installment is going to be on August 6th, and so save the date now and make plans to join us. If your question was not answered tonight, we'd love to still connect with you, so be sure to send us those emails and we'll follow up from there. So thank you guys again, and hope you guys have a great night.